Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how you learn a language. So now that we understand what is language, what are the properties and structure, and then how the brain processes the language, let's talk about how you learn a language. That's the question, is how do we do that? How do we speak, read, write, and sign in these languages? Now, I don't know about you guys, but I am learning a new language right now using Duolingo, and we'll see how some of the learning that you do on a site like Duolingo will relate to what we're learning about. Of course, other things we're going to talk about is how you learn your first language as a child. So there are different ways to learn that language. So, why do we learn a language? Obviously, it's to communicate with people, right? Children will learn a language without any formal instruction, so they don't need Duolingo or anything. They're going to learn the language pretty much just by mimicking or copying adults. Now, all languages have a common deep structure, right? And that's where they have those phonemes and morphemes that create language. So in infants, ages 1 to 3 months, they will vocalize entire ranges of phonemes. So that's what they're doing. They're kind of mimicking what they hear around them by trying to form phonemes. Now, they're not putting any meaning behind anything, but they're still producing these phonemes. Now, from the ages of 6 to 12 months, then what infants will do is they'll start to discriminate the sounds that they produce to a specific native language. So instead of just producing a wide variety and range of phonemes, they're going to start focusing the phonemes that they produce to the language that they hear around them. So if they're learning English, they're only going to start to produce those phonemes that they hear in English. Now, of course, an infant then that's in, say, China will produce different phonemes because they're going to only produce the phonemes that they hear in their native language, whether that's Mandarin or a different dialect or language that they speak in their native home. Okay? Now, this is also what we call language acquisition device. Okay? So that is that idea of where you produce those phonemes of the ones that you hear, of the ones that are native to where you are, to what the people in your home speak. Okay? Now, we do think that there's some sort of biological component to learning language. Now, why do we think that? Well, in the 80s, there was this guy called Noam Chomsky, and he proposed that humans have a language acquisition device, this LAD, where there's universal rules that apply to all languages. So sometimes you might hear these universal rules called universal grammar, because we know grammar is really just rules for language. And some of these universal rules are common components of language, like nouns and verbs. And then there's switches that can be turned on or off depending on how that rule is applied to a particular language. So for instance, does the pronoun go before a verb? Well, if you're speaking English, yes, it does. But in other languages like Spanish, then no, the pronoun goes after the verb. So there's universal rules, and then you turn the switches for the rules on or off depending on what language you're talking about. Now, language also has a social component. So even in the learning process, then social interactions are very important. So we see this a lot in parents, where parents will speak to their children in a high-pitched intonation. So this is what we'll call child-directed speech. They'll also name objects and ask questions that they wouldn't do when talking to other adults. And this is because they're trying to help their child learn the names for things. And by asking questions, then they're actually forming sentences, which allows the children to learn some of these rules, these grammar rules. So parents are directing their children's attention to them. And they're actually doing it using operant conditioning because they're giving a positive reinforcement for appropriate language. So a lot of times you'll hear this where they'll say, like, can you say this? Can you say that? And then when the child does say it, then the parent will say like, yay, and clap their hand, and they get very excited. And the child will learn from that positive reinforcement of the cheering that they did something good, that they answered the question. And then we see no reinforcement for inappropriate language or for saying the wrong word, right? Or the parent will correct them and be like, no, that's not a truck, it's a dog, or something like that. They'll correct them. So you can see how operant conditioning is used to help learn language. But we also have some evidence that not all language is done using operant conditioning. So we see this where children will actually learn a lot of words very quickly. And most of these words are not words that their parents reinforced. So children will learn some words without operant conditioning. Also, the parents tend not to correct grammar, at least not, when they're super young. So again, children tend to learn a lot of words as well as some grammar without the use of operant conditioning. So while operant conditioning helps, not all language is learned through operant conditioning. Now, there's this thing called the Language Acquisition Support System, or LAS, and this represents social factors in the environment that facilitate language learning. So an example of this would be when you bring a child to, say, preschool or, daycare or something where they can interact with other children, then they can practice their language, and they can also learn new words. They can learn other, rules of the language by interacting in this social interaction. So we see this a lot that by grade 2, children have learned between 5,000 and 6,000 words. And this is a lot more words than their parents alone could teach them. So having the social factor of, going to school and stuff is helping them acquire the language more. And this isn't just because children are learning these specific words in school. Teachers don't sit there and be like, this is a clock, this is this. So a lot of these words are just acquired through listening and interacting with others. So children don't just imitate others. There's more to it. There is some sort of biological factor. Now, again, language acquisition is a process. So the development is influenced by the experiences and biology of an individual. So all children will go through the same stages. It's just kind of exactly how long these stages last that will differ for each individual depending on their experience and their biology. But the 4 stages is cooing. So this would be the youngest. You'll see this in very young babies. Then babbling. So babbling, they'll use a lot of just those phonemes. They'll start doing that. And then they'll slowly put them together. And they'll say single words. Now again, a lot of the first single words that they say will be done through operant conditioning with their parents, but then they'll start to be able to create single words without that use of operant conditioning. After single words, you get 2 words. So they'll start stringing 2 words together. So this would be like a young child might say, want juice, or juice want. So they're trying to create speech that they've heard, but they're putting 2 words together that they know. And this is what we call telegraphic speech. Now, what about when you're learning a second language, or even a third or fourth or whatever? It's best learned and spoken most fluently when acquired in a sensitive period. So a sensitive period of language is a lot of times in younger children, or before the age of 15 usually, is when children and teens are able to learn a second or third language a lot easier because their brain is more what we call plastic. In other words, it's more flexible. We also see that the ability to learn a second language is associated with greater thinking flexibility. So people that perform better on an intelligence test. Now, we see a lot of research done with immersion students. So these are children that go to a school where they speak a different language at school than they do at home. And we see that those children actually, learn the language better. Now, there are some concerns that immersion students will fall behind in other classes, like English or science classes, because they're learning 2 languages at once. And they might confuse the 2 languages. But what we see is that doesn't happen. Immersion students actually continue to do well in all their classes. So even though they're speaking 2 different languages kind of at the same time, they still are able to learn their other classes just as well. The only time you really see a problem with learning 2 languages at once is in really young children when they are speaking 2 different languages at home. So really when they're under the age of 2. That's where you see them kind of struggle to understand the difference between the 2 languages. But once they're old enough to go to school, children do really well at learning the differences between the 2 languages. So, by measuring your ability to ignore irrelevant details, then you're actually going to be better able to kind of learn a different task. So in this figure, it shows one of the attention inhibition tasks. So in other words, you're going to be shown either a blue square or a red circle, and you have to press the keyboard letters of X or O if it matches. Now, if you see a blue square, does it match? If it matches, you press, and if it doesn't, you don't press. And what we see is that in children that only speak one language, then they have a harder time not clicking a button when things don't match. So again, this blue square does not match the red square. So you should not be pushing this button. But what we see is children that are only speaking one language, they're more likely to press the button. However, children that are bilingual or are speaking two languages, they have better inhibition. In other words, they're more likely not to press the X because they've learned, by learning a second language, how to quickly distinguish between two different things. Okay? So learning a second language, being bilingual, helps you in other tasks other than just language. Now, obviously, you can always learn a language. Like I said, I'm starting to learn a new language on Duolingo, kind of because, quarantine's got me bored, guys. So I'm clearly older than 15. I don't know if you guys know this, but I'm like twice that. Not quite, but I'm getting there. I'm almost 30. So I am outside that ideal age. I'm over here. I'm in the 17 to 39 group. So you can see how learning is a lot lower than the younger children. But you are still able to learn. Now, this is a graph example of learning English. So the greenish blue line is for native Chinese and Korean speakers, and the red line is for native Spanish speakers. So again, if you're learning English at ages 3 to kind of 10, you're going to do pretty well. Now, once you get older, Spanish is more similar to English. So as you get older, you're still not going to do as well, but you're going to do a lot better than if your native language is a language that's unrelated. So Chinese and Korean is very different than English, so they're not going to do as well as, say, a Spanish speaker. But again, you can still see that they can still learn. And that's a very important thing. So you're never too old to learn a language. However, the younger you start, the better off you'll be.